Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. We've talked plenty in the past about culture, and it can often be a bit of a vague concept. The wrong culture in an organisation is a risk, just like systems risks or investment risks. When you get it right, a company grows. When you get it wrong, the hit to shareholders potentially can be swift and significant. Peter Deans is the former Chief Risk Officer at Bank of Queensland and is the founder of risk consultancy 52 Risks. Peter, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Hi, Sean. Great to be here.
Putting you on the spot here, off the top of your head, what's been the most expensive failure of culture you've seen?
That's a really great question. I guess you're the Olympics. You're out of the blocks very, very fast today. Unfortunately, there's just so many examples of where culture has a significant impact on an organisation's value. I think going back a little way around the GFC, Lehman Brothers was probably the most spectacular cultural and, it's management failure at the end of the day. I think Lehman's market cap was about $60 billion US in 2007, and within 12 months or so it was down to zero. As an outsider, it's always difficult to sort of put your finger on what's the cause of it, and it's only afterwards when people go digging and the media finds out a bit more about what's happened, or you might have regulatory inquiries, you find out a bit more about how bad the culture was or how bad an organisation was managed. I think domestically, one of the recent examples we've seen is AMP. AMP going back even as recently as 2016, it had market cap of about 13 billion. And I think today it's around about 4 billion, which is a significant drop. And what we've seen with AMP is a series of issues which really do go to culture and probably management competence. The two seem to be linked together.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you define culture? And kind of where does CEO and the C-suite, where do they play in that?
I think the cliched term of the tone from the top is really key to it. I think the tone that the board sets, particularly this is listed companies predominantly, but even private companies, the tone that's set from the board, the way management goes about doing their business. And I remember someone saying to me years ago, culture's the way we do things here. And as you can see from a lot of the really, bad examples we've had domestically in the last 12 months or so, it is really just a feature of the way we do things here and the way we badly do things here, unfortunately, for a lot of the dirty laundry that you see come out whenever there's profit issues or, misconduct or regulatory issues. Again, culture and the way things have been done is really the failing.
So is it the board and the chair and the CEO and the CFO? Is it how they behave in the office? Is it the sorts of emails they send? I'm trying to get really tangible in terms of how to create a good culture, because it does flow from the top, as you say. Is it how they hold themselves? Is it how they speak to people? Is it, obviously they have to make right or wrong decisions.
It's really everything. And, governance is always a fairly dry word, but I'm a real believer that it comes down to the governance arrangements in place, how the boards interact with themselves, how the chairperson interacts with the other board members, with the CEO, with management. One of the traits you often see, it's probably less so today, but going back 10 years ago, you'd quite often have boards who would only meet the CEO. They'd have a board meeting, the CEO would come in for 2 or 3 hours, and then the board meeting's over. Or you might have the CFO come in to present the financial statements for 30 minutes or so, and then, meeting closed and they're off to the next board meeting. And I'll come to the next board meeting. It's also a bit of a challenge, the number of boards that directors are on. But what you're seeing now, good examples of what works is the boards will be seeing a lot more of the executive team. They'll be having one-on-ones with them outside the board meeting. And it's a bit of getting a sense of the look and feel. And I think boards now, certainly the high-performing ones, know that they need to get under the covers of the organisation, personally sort of get a sense of how the organisation is run. There's a lot of tools you can use, a lot of consultants and surveys, but ultimately it's up to boards to have a really good sense of how the CEO and the executive team are managing the organisation. And things like, whistleblower lines and how boards deal with whistleblower complaints, that's also a good example of how culture works and how executive teams respond to things like complaints. And, my executive career was always like, okay, well, maybe we're not perfect, maybe we've missed something, or maybe there's some people in the organisation who are not sharing the same values we had. So it's part of just having an open, honest and frank assessment of how the business is being run is a really positive feature of organisations that have got a good culture.
I suppose I'm being devil's advocate. I remember the APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority report into Commonwealth Bank and its board, done by a guy called John Laker, who was an APRA chair for a long while. And one of the things that I remember from that is he said that you'd get the division heads coming to the board, but the board don't know enough about the business simply because they're not in the business every day. And you get a division head coming and talking about the retail bank or the institutional bank, and it sort of bamboozled them with, you know what the next word is. And in a way, it was really hard, though, for the board to actually get across that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of issues. And that APRA Prudential report is a fantastic report. It was John Laker and two other colleagues. That
is the hardest hitting regulatory report I have ever read. You know, even if you're not into this sort of stuff, it's worth reading that one.
Yeah, absolutely. It didn't pull any punches, but it's ended up being quite a seminal governance document on, you know, what both good looks like and things to avoid. But I think one of the challenges for boards is they're still fundamentally part-time roles. So a director can have 3 or 4 part-time roles. They will go from company to company, often in different industries. And as you've touched on in financial services, yeah, a lot of the concepts and a lot of the businesses got quite a bit of technical nuances to it. I think if you look at something like pharmaceutical or healthcare as well, you know, a lot of technical knowledge is needed to be able to discharge your duties as a director. And I think the challenge for part-time directors, particularly who don't have the expertise in the area, is that they're probably at a bit of a disadvantage and possibly more reliant on other board members to sort of carry their weight a little bit in some of these technical areas. And this is a bit of the balance that, you know, I think the director industry in Australia struggles with a little bit is, well, we want to have the diversity of thought. We want to have, you know, IT specialists. We want to have cybersecurity specialists. We want to have really good sales and marketing expertise. But at the same time, you need to marry that with technical expertise in whatever particular industry it is.
Yeah.
I said earlier on that the challenges of going from board to board meeting is also a bit of a problem. Some directors, if you've got 3 or 4 very large boards, it's not only a full-time job, it's more than a full-time job. And, you know, how do you sort of drop in and out of an organisation every couple of weeks or every month for a board meeting and stay abreast of industry developments and stay abreast of what's happening in that company? And as I said earlier, trying to actually have the one-on-ones with the executives periodically during the year, it actually becomes a pretty tough task to do it properly.
Yeah.
And, you know, we haven't had a debate about professional directors in Australia for quite a while now, but you know, overseas in some countries, you actually have directors who are just full-time executive directors.
Stay with me, Peter. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to Peter Deans, founder of risk consultancy 52 Risks. Just shifting it a little bit, do things like vision statements, true norths of companies matter?
I think you've got to start somewhere. A company has to have a purpose. It has to anchor itself to some basic values and have a shared vision. You know, it's probably a leadership issue here that leaders, be it the chair or the CEO, they really need to articulate what the purpose of the business is, you know, what they really stand for and which direction they're going for. Otherwise, I think you do have an organisation that's a bit all at sea and not really knowing, you know, what they stand for, or there might be confusing messages about what they stand for.
Okay, and so do you think companies think enough about that and also enough about culture and the fact that it is a risk to their business?
Well, they always, when something goes wrong, they spend a lot of time thinking about what went wrong or why did this culture evolve. Culture is very hard to put on a piece of paper. I think the strategic vision and, you know, where a company's headed is probably easier to put on a piece of paper. You know, there's always a bit of wordsmithing trying to get the words right, but the more important thing is to make sure that every employee, you know, all of your customers and all of your suppliers, they all understand which direction you're headed in, you know, what the business stands for values-wise. I think the implementation is the really important part and really living and breathing the values as well. There's quite a famous example like 20-odd years ago in the US, Enron. And Enron had on paper the best vision, values, the best commitment to managing risk, but that was where it stayed. It didn't actually come off the paper. Of course, Some of your listeners will know it blew up quite spectacularly, a bit like Lehman's, because everything they did was completely the opposite of what they had written down in print.
So where does it fit? I mean, in recent years, the banks and AMP are great examples, theoretically, of poor culture. And you think of the Banking Royal Commission and payment for financial advice that was never received, anti-money laundering allegations. It's okay to say that, but these are really big organisations as well. And sometimes in those instances, it was actually criminal activity rather than culture. How do you unwind all that sort of thing?
Yeah, and again, it goes probably to values a little bit. I think the core that came out of the Hayne Royal Commission was really profit at all costs. It was the desire, the need, or the budget budget requirement to actually sell at all costs. Now, it wasn't stated that way, but the way the organisations were set up, the way the executive remuneration was structured, it actually led to that outcome of to sell at absolutely all costs,
Yeah.
particularly when it's a very competitive market in financial services in Australia. Even though we've got a bit of concentration with the four majors, it is still fundamentally a very competitive industry, whether it's mortgages, whether it's life insurance, or whether it's commercial lending. It's a very competitive industry. And if you've got management teams that are highly incentivized, and in some cases were solely incentivized by selling the product, you ended up with these adverse outcomes. And again, it almost undoes all of the good work that might be done alongside around culture and values, because the overriding message that comes down, and again, this comes down not just from board, but it comes down from investors as well, where investors were constantly, is your earnings per share growth going to be X? Is it going to be above industry average? And that builds up a lot of pressure on boards, CEOs, CFOs, and executive teams. And I think, again, it's really profit at all costs, I think, was the issue there. And it's hard to say whether it still is an issue across a lot of industries, but there's certainly a lot more awareness now. And if you look at APRA, for example, its supervisory activities is very much focused on making sure there isn't this misalignment.
Yeah. COVID, did that have much of an impact? It seemed for most of society, it almost softened society, and we did think about this sort of thing a lot more. Is that the same?
Yeah, I think if you look at the banking industry, it's almost completely rehabilitated itself as a result of COVID.
Sure has.
It went from having a reputation which was in the trash can 2 years ago to, I think, back where the banks, I generally believe they should be, which is respected institutions that do a lot of good, providing finance for consumers to buy houses or businesses to grow. I mean, I think COVID and the bank's response to that has been, a big part of it, where the banks did actually, get together, and they obviously got together with the federal government and Treasury and sort of said, we need to collectively find a way through this very difficult period. I think the accommodation that the banks gave, whether it's hardship, principal deferrals, I think was well received. And I think we've also had a change of leadership at the four major banks and probably across the whole banking sector now. And the leadership teams that were there sort of 5 years or so ago have all turned over. And, I think the signs are quite positive that they're a lot more alert to the need to be a good corporate citizen.
Peter, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Great, Sean. Talk again soon.
That was Peter Deans, founder of risk consultancy 52 Risks. This is a Fear and Greed daily interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.